you have any questions, please, just send me that. And with that, I want to ask that we start the presentation and we go to the next slide. And this is what I want us to cover in 20 minutes. It's very ambitious, but I think we can do it. We want to understand what being African means. And we also want to ask the impact, what is important, how law and religion are important to African traditional societies. And then we want to look at the concept of justice, and then justice in African traditional societies. We are going to look at Ubuntu. I'll not redefine Ubuntu, but then we will look at just law and order in African traditional societies, and then justice in African traditional societies. I think that part of the presentation will select African communities or societies. I may not cover that for now, but I think I'm going to lay a foundation good enough for you to understand what it is I was speaking about. Now, well, one of the African languages, one of the African continental languages is Swahili, and Kiswahili, wahenga wa Swahili have a saying that mwachamila ni mtumwa, which means only a slave discards his or her culture. Therefore, then, when we want to talk about justice, especially in post-colonial Africa, then we must ask ourselves, are we making every effort to forget who we are? And therefore, then we have kept ourselves to the slavery that was colonialism, or we've woken up to the reality of who we are today and can actually accept us by understanding the notions of justice as we understand them and apply them in our world. If we continue then, I want to ask then next, I want to ask us to understand how Africans thought. What made sense to the African? What makes sense to the African? That is me. And I want to ask that you remember that in Africa, there were 3 steps, the 3 stages of life. One is born, one gets to marry, and one dies. The unborn had to be born. The living had to marry and give birth to people, to children. And we also had to exit the stage so that the journey of life, the circle of life could continue. And death was not an end for the African. In fact, when you died, you became the living dead. Once you fade from the memory of the people who are alive, then you become an ancestor and later a spirit. But then if I continue then, I want to ask that we remember that the circle of life, circle of life, circle of life. We had at the very highest, maybe lowest as you look at it, it's a circle, therefore there's no one at the highest, but then we have the unborn, we have the living, then we have the living dead, then we have the ancestors, and then the spirits, and then other deities, other divinities, and then finally, and in most African societies, they believe in the existence of one God. With this then, I want to continue to understand that everyone had a purpose. The society would not exist, or it would not continue if the unborn were not there. But I want to ask also, when you're talking about justice in African traditional societies, then we must, and each people have their own religious systems with a set of belief and practices. Each go across Africa, that is true. And then there was no, and there continues to be no distinction between the secular, the sacred, the spiritual, or the material realms. All these are meshed into one. All these are meshed into one. And therefore, to understand justice in African traditional societies, one must understand understand the interplay between traditional religions and life in African traditional society. Okay, if you can then, I have defined justice, the delicate state of being in the circle of life, which ensures that both the individual and the society flourishes. That's the concept of justice. That you, while you're dealing with issues to do with the individual, it's not divorce it from the fact that the individual is part of the society. And certain things that we do affect the society in more ways than we can accept. So then justice is ensuring that we maintain a delicate balance between the circle of life, the state of being in the circle of life, to ensure that both the individual and the society flourishes. And therefore, then, when you want to talk about, well, there's the temptation to say African traditional judicial system. I don't think there was such a thing, but I would want to say that there was an African justice system, and that justice system balanced the interest between the individual and the community to ensure that the balance of the state of being is maintained. Okay. Therefore, then, a justice process would be to establish the offense. There were three-pronged. It was three-pronged. Number one, establish the offense, the offender. Okay, establish the offender. Number two, establish that there was an offense. Number two, apportion liability to whoever committed the offense. And then number three, prescribe restorative measures to be taken to restore the established order. And that restorative measure would be both physical and spiritual. Okay, and that I'll explain later. If you continue then, I want to ask you to remember that the concept of justice in African traditional religion was largely restorative. Africa organized itself, and that continued to organize itself in a very, it's communal. And almost everyone knows everyone, or at least they can establish connection between this person to this person to this person. If you asked me who I was, I can go 10, 15 generations of who I am, to the point where I can describe how I am related to the very people farthest to my, yet as long as they speak my language, I can establish a relationship. And therefore then, if an offense is committed against an individual, it is not just an offense against an individual, it's an offense against a family, it is an offense against the society, and it is also an offense against the what? The higher ups in the hierarchy of beings. You remember, from the living, we go to the living dead, then we go to the ancestors, then we go to the what? The spirits, and then the deities, then God, okay? And then finally, a reconciliation and reform was the first option. But I also want to ask, let us not be very romantic about what was. I want us to be confirmed that the justice system in African traditional religion or societies could also be very punitive, including, and it could even lead to death. Okay, so yes, the first option we will give is to restore and to try to reconcile, but at the same time, this was not the end, it could even lead to death. Now, the judicial the process, someone has talked about this thing they've called natural justice. The process, there's also a process to accessing justice. And in African traditional society, there is a process to accessing justice. And I have used the term figures of authority because I could not get one word to describe those who sat down to decide disputes between people. But then these figures of authority would sit with all interested members of the world, all interested members of the society in the process. You have right, if you are interested, to attend and be part and parcel of the process. Sometimes you would be given a right of speech. You could address the congregation, but many times it would be only those who are directly involved in the issue will be called upon to speak. And then a lot of times in African traditional societies, the process was aimed at establishing truth. Unless someone says truth is not very objective, I have defined truth as the establishment of facts that led to the commission of the offense. One, who did it, why, when, how. Truth. And then finally, then the figures of authority would try to resolve the issue. But if they fail, then it would be left to the divinities, the spirits. And I want to ask, when you talk about African traditional societies, our imagination is that it is something that happened in the past. I want to ask you to remember that even in this country, African traditional justice system caters for over 70% of disputes. Over 70% of disputes are resolved within the African traditional justice systems. Yet we speak today that they are alternatives. When you are dealing with 70% of disputes, how can it be an alternative? Questions that we must ask. But if they failed, then what they would do is now most places in most societies, they would refer this to people with powers to see beyond and to divine. Okay, and I want to ask you to remember that a lot of these things still happen in Africa today. I will very shortly talk about the Luos of Kenya. And the Luos of Kenya do not have one central figure as a leader. They are organized into different clans. And those different clans, the only thing that brings them together is a council of elders, who is led by a Kir, a leader. Their leader was called a Kir. And they would not sit to discuss disputes on individuals, or they would only sit to discuss issues to interclan issues and issues of foreign relations. We are nations in our own rights. We are nations in our own rights. How do we deal with our neighbors? Issues of foreign relations. And then, of course, at lower than that, there would be clan councils of elders led by an Ogai. Ogai was, depending on what issues are, anyone could be appointed an Ogai to just sit and chair a meeting to discuss issues or to decide a case. And then, of course, the Luos had this thing, they wanted to restore relationships. Many times, the person who has offended you has committed, you have had a lifetime of interaction. And therefore, then, this must just be an abnormality. In otherwise, a very peaceful, interactive process. And therefore, if that happens, we try to resolve when at least we will consider the interests of the victims. The victims include the individual, the family, and his immediate clan. And then, of course, we will also consider how do we deal with the higher-ups. How do we, for example, there might be a cleansing ceremony to deal with restore, to plead on behalf of us, that don't let this difficult thing, this unfortunate catastrophe to fall us. And therefore, then I want to ask that you remember that if the higher ups, if our elders could not resolve issues, then we could invoke, and some people still do, invoke the help of the people with divine powers. For example, what we have called magicians, or Ajuoke, or Jonyakalondo. And then, of course, there is also what we call the trial by ordeal. Trial by ordeal is where suspects are suspects. As a suspect, if you're a suspect in Luo, you're called an achich, and this achich would be made to take a concoction called Muma. And we still do, that if you are guilty and you take this concoction, very bad things would follow. And a lot of things happen. By the way, there are some things also amongst our people that there are certain cultural norms that you're not supposed to go against. But there's no way of telling if you go against them sometimes. And then we believed also that there was this thing we call Chira. Chira would be a way where the divinities intervene directly. And then people would die mysteriously, would suffer certain misfortunes that can't be understood. And all these things were aimed at bring back the balance of the state of being to ensure that the individual flourishes, the system flourishes, the community, family flourishes, and the whatever flourishes. I am not going to talk about the Gikuyu of Kenya. Dean Juridical has spoken about this, and I liked the Gikuyu for one thing. They had an appellate system. At the very lowest, they had a 5-tier Council of Elders, Council of Junior Warriors, Council of Senior Warriors, Council of Peace, a Council of Religious Sacrificial, all these people. And even at the family level, they had the lowest council. And if you did not agree with this ones, you'd go to the next and to the next until you get to the highest. And the highest on land was Kiama Kia Kamatimo. Okay. And then, okay, then that one thing is, disputes would be, one would even be called upon to take customary oath. Oathing was a very serious thing. If you took an oath and you are lying in that oath, a lot of bad things would follow. And there were also, one thing about them is for every crime, there were specified penalties. They're very clear about that. I think the last people I want to talk about are the Akambas. And I want to say that Akamba are they were very much like the Kikuyu, except that one of their most famous ways of resolving dispute is the Kithitu system. And many of us who are not even Kambas have had, and even the courts have had to deal with the Kithitu issue. Because this is where, when you decide not to, if you go on to the next, when you decide to, if the councils can't resolve, then we call the people with these powers we can understand. And they can have people go through a process. And that process, we have seen people eating grass. We have seen people returning property as a result of that system. And therefore then, I want to finish by making the following statement. Today, as I was preparing, I put up the poster for this event, as I was inviting people to join, and one on Facebook, and someone made a comment, and the comment that they made was, they wonder why Africans always want to bring in non-Africans or Western people to try to explain to them ideas that are originally African. And the person who was asking that question is my friend. We did our masters in Geneva, in Switzerland at the same time. Currently he's speaking, I know he's in one of his Western capitals doing his PhD. And what I want to ask is, we have, as Africans, gone out there and embraced other ideas. We must choose to think globally while we act locally. And the last thing that I want to ask, I want to ask that, except for Nigeria and South Africa, that have made very concerted efforts at mainstreaming African traditional justice systems, many African nations have ignored it. In fact, in Kenya, they are saying that African traditional practices are applicable as long as they are not repugnant to justice and morality. And that was the Judicature Act of the Kenyan Judicature Act of 1897, you know, and the standard for morality was the British morality. We have picked it up in the 2010 Constitution. It is there. The question that I ask, that I wish you guys to join me in asking, why should we not fail? Why should we fail to have that which rule us reflect the values that we hold? Why should African justice system be an alternative? Yet we know that most of disputes in Kenya are solved through African traditional religion. Let me finish with a quote from Haile Selassie. And he says, always be yourself, express yourself, have faith in yourself. Do not go out and look for a successful personality. and duplicate it. Africa, my speech to you today is, let us choose to be proudly African. And in us, there are certain things that are very good, which indeed can be used to transform us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. May we please give him another hand of applause?